بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما تعلمنا وزدنا من فضلك علما نافعا وعملا صالحا متقبلا وزدنا من فضلك حكمة وتعليما خالصا لوجهك موفقا وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين. We are going to go through a number of cases of how to do i'rab of asma. So there are two different concerns here. The first concern is, when is an ism in a particular i'rabi state? When does a word take on a particular inflection, such as rafa, nasb, or jar? Because if you remember, there are three inflections for asma, for nouns: rafa, nasb, and jar. So the first question, or the first area of study, is when does an ism take on those various different states? And the second is, what are the obvious signs, or what are the harakat or letters, what are the vowels or letters that represent that that ism is in that particular state? And so the first of those, which is when is an ism marfu'a, or when is it mansub, or when is it majroor, is actually the discussion of the rest of Nahu that we'll be studying, inshallah, from now until only Allah knows how long. And so that's quite lengthy. It'll take us some time to cover all those cases. But what are the signs of an ism being marfu'a or mansub or majroor? That's actually a little bit easier. So we're going to start with that, bi'idhnillah. Now, in order to be able to have a working knowledge of how to use the signs of inflections, we're going to do a few cases. So let's do a few simple cases of when an ism is marfu'a, and when it is mansub, and when it is majroor. So first of all, when is an ism marfu'a? So an ism is marfu'a. We'll do three cases. One, when it is the fa'il, or in other words, the subject of a verb. Two, when it is the subject of a nounal sentence. And three, when it is the predicate of a nounal sentence. So let's take a look at various examples of this. So when is an ism marfu'a? When it is the fa'il of a verb, when it is the subject of a verb, when it is the one who is doing or acting upon the verb. Let's say, for example, we'll start with a past tense verb. So if we were to say ja'a Zayd, we'd say ja'a Zaydun. Why Zaydun? Why does it have a dhamma? For these cases we're covering now, a dhamma is the sign of it being in the state of rafa. We'll cover other cases in the future, inshallah. So, ja'a Zaydun, the dhamma on Zaydun is an indication that Zayd is the fa'il, or is the doer, or is the subject of that verb. Let's say we take another example where we use a present tense verb. So, for example, if we were to say, yadrusu Zaydun fil jami'ati. So yadrusu Zaydun, Zayd studies, or Zayd is studying at university. So Zayd again is the fa'il, and so therefore his name is marfu'a, and the sign of it being marfu'a is a dhamma. So as we mentioned last class, there are two types of sentences in Arabic. One of them is a verbal sentence, and all sentences pretty much in English are verbal. There might be some rare exceptions, but pretty much every sentence in English is verbal. In Arabic, we have verbal sentences, but we also have nounal or nominal sentences which involve no verbs, which is where you're just basically stating a relationship between two isms as the simplest case. So for example, if we wanted to say that Zayd is a student, we'd say Zaydun talibun. So as you notice here, we don't need a verb in Arabic to say that Zayd is a student. Zayd here is what's called the mubtada of the nounal sentence, and talibun is what's called the khabar. So Zayd is the subject and talib is the predicate. So this type of sentence in Arabic is called jumlatun ismiya, and the sentence before it is called jumla fi'liya. So a jumla fi'liya consists at minimum of a verb and an ism. And the jumla ismiya consists at minimum of two isms. So the first being the mubtada. So here Zaydun is the mubtada and talibun is the khabar. And both of those are marfu'a. So that's an example of when an ism is marfu'a and what kind of sign it takes. When is an ism mansoob? There are many cases. We're not going to cover nearly all of them, but we'll just go through some of those cases. If we were to say, for example, the object of a verb. So an ism is mansoob, and we'll just cover one case of many cases when it is the maf'ul bihi or object of a verb. A verbal sentence at minimum consists of a verb and a noun. The verb taking its obvious role, and the noun usually, we'll just keep it simple for now, the noun being the fa'il or the subject of the verb. Now, a verb can also take two nouns or act upon two nouns or more, as we'll learn later, where one is the subject and the next is the object. If we were to give an example of a verbal sentence with a subject and an object, we could say قرأ زيد الكتاب. So you see here that قرأ is the verb, Zayd is the subject, so it's marfu'a, and the sign of it being marfu'a is that it takes a dhamma at the end. And al-kitab is the maf'ul bihi or the object, and as such it takes a fatha. So the default sign of something being mansoob is that it takes a fatha, and the default sign that something is marfu'a is that it takes a dhamma. So قرأ زيد الكتاب. We'll do one with a present tense verb. For example, if we were to say يقرأ زيد الكتاب. So it's pretty much the same, but now the verb, instead of being past tense, is present tense. So Zayd is reading the book. Now, in this case, we will take also an imperative verb, and we will say اقرأ, read the book. اقرأ الكتاب. So we see here that the verb has a maf'ul bihi, which is al-kitaba, which is mansoob because it's a maf'ul bihi. The object is mansoob, and the sign of it being mansoob is a fatha. So where is the subject of that verb? Where's the subject of this verb, iqra? So it's implicit or hidden in iqra. So a verb always does rafa to exactly one ism. And that ism may be implicit, but it always does rafa. And that ism isn't always the subject. It can be something else that we'll cover later, inshallah. Okay, so we see that an ism is marfu'a when it's the fa'al, when it's the subject of a nounal sentence, when it's the predicate of a nounal sentence. So terminology again, a verbal sentence is a jumla fi'liya. A nounal sentence is a jumla ismiya. The subject of a verbal sentence is called the fa'il. The subject of a nounal sentence is called the mubtada, and its predicate is called the khabar. When is something majroor? There are only really two cases when something is majroor, and so we'll cover both of those now. So an ism is majroor in two cases. One, when it is preceded by a genitive particle, which is a harf jar. So there are certain kinds of particles that cause the ism after them to be majroor. And so if one of those precedes an ism, then that ism is majroor. And we'll cover some examples of that. And the second case is when it is mudaf ilayhi. And we'll talk about this now, inshallah, and what that means. So first, let's give an example of when it has a harf jar before it. Someone give me an example of a harf jar, just one. Fi. So the huruf al-jar are a group of particles, and they cause the ism after them to be in the majroor state, meaning to end in a kasra by default. So these include min, ila, an, ala, fi, rubba, ba, and kaf. Now, there are others, but we'll stick with those for now. So min, if there's min before an ism, then it becomes majroor. If there's ila, if there's an, ala, fi, rubba, ba, kaf, all of those cause the ism after them to be majroor. So if we take a look at this and write an example of where a word is preceded by a genitive particle. So if I were to say دخلت في الفصل, دخلت, I entered, في الفصل, into the classroom. So what would be the haraka? What would be the vowel on the end of the word fasl? It would be a kasra. Why? Because it's majroor. Why is it majroor? Because there's fi before it. And so therefore we would say dakhaltu fil fasli. We'll do another example. If I were to say I passed by Zaid, I'd say, for example, marartu bi Zaydin. Marartu bi Zaydin. So I passed by Zaid. So because there's a ba attached to the word Zaid, Zaid is now majroor and it takes a kasra. Let's take a look at when something is mudaf ilayh. So there's a concept called the mudaf and the mudaf ilayh. The mudaf and the mudaf ilayh is essentially a way of showing ownership, or ascription rather, that something belongs to something or something is of something else. So for example, if I wanted to say Zaid's pen, what's the word for pen? The word for pen is qalamun. So I would say in Arabic, Zaidun. So what we do in idafa here is we remove the tanween, if it exists, from the first word, and we put a kasra on the second word. So to say Zaid's pen, so let me just write out these rules. 1, remove tanween from the mudaf, which is the first word, and make the mudaf ilayhi, which is the second word, majroor. So to say Zaid's pen, we would say qalamu Zaydin. Qalamu Zaydin. Now this is just in a vacuum. The i'rab of the mudaf and the mudaf ilayh always goes on to the mudaf. So if I were to say, for example, this is Zaid's pen, so هذا قلم زيد. So هذا here is the mubtada, or is the subject. So it should be marfu'a, but as we'll find out later, it's a class of words called mabni that never changes. Qalamu is the khabar, therefore it's also marfu'a because both the mubtada and the khabar are marfu'a, and so it takes a dhamma. But in this case, it doesn't take two dhammas because it's mudaf. And the i'rab of a mudaf ilayh construction always goes on the mudaf, and the mudaf ilayh remains majroor. So I'd say هذا قلم زيد. هذا is the mubtada, qalam is the khabar, and it's marfu'a, and the sign of it being marfu'a is a dhamma, and the sign of it being mudaf is that it has no tanween, and Zaid is majroor because it's mudaf ilayh. And if I were to say, for example, I bought Zaid's pen, I'd say اشتريت قلم زيد. I bought Zaid's pen. اشتريت قلم زيد. So here, اشتري, that part of the word, is a verb. And the to means I. So I bought. And then qalam is the maf'ul bihi, is the object. I bought Zaid's pen, or the pen of Zaid. So it's maf'ul bihi, so it's mansoob, and therefore it has a fatha on it, and it doesn't have tanween because it's mudaf, and Zaid is again mudaf ilayh majroor. So we see that whether it's marfu'a or mansoob, the mudaf ilayh is always majroor. If I were to say, for example, katabtu, I wrote, bi, with, qalami Zaydin. You should get used to this construction. Katabtu and ishtaraitu and these sort of things is both a verb and its subject. Words like ishtaraitu and katabtu are a combination of a verb and its subject. So ishtaraitu means I bought. Katabtu means I wrote. They're both a verb along with its subject. That's basically two words in one, even though it's written as one word. Katabtu is the verb and its subject. Be is a harf jar, is a genitive particle. Qalam is majroor because it's preceded by a harf jar. And because it's a mudaf, it doesn't have tanween, so it only has one kasra, and Zayd remains mudaf ilayh. And so the mudaf and mudaf ilayh construction occurs in a lot of words. For example, Abdullah, the name, or Rasulullah, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, or Kitabullah, or Babul Masjidi, or what have you. So let's do an example of the name Abdullah. So if we were to say, for example, Ja'a Abd Allah, and Ra'aytu Abd Allah, and Marartu bi Abd Allah. So I'm going to ask you to vowelize these. So Ja'a is a verb, and we want to say that Abdullah came or Abdullah arrived. So the haraka on Ja'a is a fatha. What is the haraka on Abd? It's a dhamma. So Ja'a Abdu, because he's the fa'il. And when we speak about the word Allah, we would never say that Allah is marfu' or mansub or majroor, but rather we say lafzul jalala, which means the supreme pronunciation or the supreme word, which I'll often just use the expression the supreme name for. So we don't say that Allah is marfu' or mansub or majroor, but rather we say that lafzul jalala is marfu' or mansub or majroor. And that's out of adab with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So lafzul jalala here, what is the haraka on it? Kasra. It has to be because it's mudaf ilayh. So that's Ja'a Abdullahi. Now Ra'aytu, I saw. What's the haraka on Abd here? Ra'aytu Abd, it's a maf'ul bihi. So Ra'aytu Abdallahi. And Marartu bi, here there's a harf jar before it. So what would be the haraka on it? Kasra. So Marartu bi Abdillahi. And another rule that you may or may not have covered is regarding the supreme name, the divine name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If it is preceded by a fatha or a dhamma, then it is pronounced Allah. But if it is preceded by something that ends in a kasra, then it is pronounced like billah. So we would say, for example, Wallahu ghafurun Rahim. Wallahu, because you see the wow before it has a fatha. If we were to begin with a kasra before, for example, like ba, we would say billahi, or for example, bismillahi, because the letter before the divine name is with a kasra. If we were to say, for example, Rasul, we would say Rasulullahi, because the letter before the divine name is with a dhamma. So we've covered the very simple cases of when something is marfu'a, when an ism is marfu'a, mansub, or majroor, and the very simple cases of what the signs are for a singular ism, and we'll do the case of the dual and plural in future classes. هذا وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والله تعالى أعلم وأحكم وهو حسبنا ونعم الوكيل. السلام عليكم.